Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Neuroplasticity Alliance's Therapy Innovation Summit. I am your host, Emily Applegate. I am delighted to be talking to Dr. Clark Elliott, Professor of Artificial Intelligence and Cognitive Science at DePaul University, and author of the book, Ghost in My Brain. For so many of you, Dr. Elliott needs no introduction. His book has had a profound effect on so many who have suffered from traumatic brain injury, including myself. Clark has had a special role in my life. 2 years ago, after my injury, I thought to Google traumatic brain injury, which led me to Clark's book, and later Dr. Zielinski, Dr. Marcus, and a dramatic improvement in my recovery. Norman Doidge, well-known author, wrote of The Ghost in My Brain, the most meticulous and informative account I have ever read of the effects of a traumatic brain injury on a single mind. Dr. Elliott has spent years sharing his experience and insights about the book after it was published in 2015 in order to help others. We are so lucky to have him here today with us to reflect on his impactful work and connection with others suffering with TBI and concussion. Clark, thank you so much and welcome.
Thanks so much, Emily. And thank you for your efforts on behalf of so many people like me who are still suffering from these head injuries. I recovered, but obviously so many more have not. So thank you for that.
Yes. Well, let's dive in. For those who may not have had a chance to read your book yet, if you could give us just kind of an overview of, your accident and your experience, that would be great to get us started.
Sure. In 1999, I was rear-ended in a traffic accident. It didn't seem like that big a deal to me, and I didn't realize it at the time, but I suffered a fairly significant brain injury from the impact, which came, to the back of my head. Within a few days, I could not even reliably tell what shoe was supposed to go on which foot, which you think, you've been sort of humbled if you're an artificial intelligence professor and you can't get your shoes on the right feet. I couldn't read, I couldn't sleep, I couldn't understand what people were saying to me. I was exhausted all the time because even the simplest activities, Emily, as you know, were a huge challenge. I didn't understand time or calendars. If I used my brain at all to solve even the simplest problems, I had terrible balance difficulties and head pain as a result. If I pushed myself to spend even, say, 15 minutes balancing my checkbook, I would be sick for days. I was in pain all the time and used to lie down, unfortunately, in a bathtub full of ice and freezing water just to get some kind of relief. I got very slightly better over the course of 2 years, but was told by virtually everyone that I saw, and many quite expert people at the time, that I would have to live with my symptoms for the rest of my life because no one with my kind of head injury ever got better. For some reason, because of my curiosity as a professor of artificial intelligence, Emily, I took 1,200 pages of notes, and they were detailed notes of my experience during that period. And I might comment that this was really hard. Remember that during that period, I often couldn't read and I had a lot of trouble even getting my hand to move correctly. So I had trouble with the motor skills of writing down my experiences, which ended up on napkins and Post-it notes that later I could come back and when I was doing a little bit better and try to organize at least in some sort of collection that I could then get back to later. And those were the basis of the Ghost book.
Wow, yeah, so many of those symptoms you mentioned sound familiar to me.
And I'm sorry for that, Emily.
Yes, but truly amazing, as you mentioned, that you were able to write down so much information about what you were going through. I know over the last 7 years since the book's been published, hundreds and hundreds of readers have reached out to you. And so I wonder if we could go into some of those themes across the correspondence and some of the themes across, the experience of living with the TBI.
Sure. Since the publication of the book, it happens that I've spoken to something like 15 million people via the various radio and TV interviews and then public speaking. And as a result of that, people do write to me. They still write to me, possibly every week, several times a week. And when they write to me, their thoughts are almost invariably contained in long, passionate communications. For many, the Ghost book was the first ever acknowledgement of their experience after a year or 2 years or 10 years. So many have been told that they're making it up, that they're mentally ill, that they're exaggerating, they're malingerers, that they need psychoactive drugs and so on. And Ghost made clear that these symptoms, clear to them and to others around them, that these symptoms were a result of physical damage to the brain, like having a broken leg. And some themes have come out of, these communications with me that I can share with you because they were very common themes. So, I, have a couple of notes on those. And let me introduce some of those and stop me if you get enough. So in no particular order, but common themes that people write about fall into these categories. So one that was surprising to me is the metaphor I used of the 3 levels of batteries. And the idea here is that, and this can be very troubling for those of us who are suffering from these head injury symptoms. And what happens is we'll take some task like photocopying an article, which involves visual rotations and spatial reasoning about is it front or back and so on. So we'll make a copy at 11 in the morning and we're not exhibiting any symptoms that others can see. And everything seems fine. But then someone might ask us, oh, could you copy this other article for me? And if I do that now, because I'm already tired from having done it for 10 minutes earlier today, that I may be sick for 2 days. And the way I describe this in the book is the metaphor is like batteries, that we have these top level, A-level batteries. And if we withdraw the juice from those batteries to perform these daily tasks that are now hard for us, it's okay. And we'll recover pretty rapidly. But those batteries are not all that powerful. And we have to hoard the energy in them as we do these normal daily tasks that are not trouble for others. But if we use up those A-level batteries and we don't have enough time for them to recharge, then we have to go into what I call these B-level, mid-level batteries. And if we drain those to perform some tasks, such as performing those visual spatial rotations of making the photocopy later in the day, because we haven't rested enough, then it may take us a couple of days to recover from that we really have depleted resources that are going to be a problem for us for some time. And then if we have to dig deep into a time when we're trying to recover those B-level batteries and the A level on top of those are the deep C-level batteries I describe in the book, which may take us a week or 2 to recover from. Now, it's great that we have them because it means you can go out with your kids, and if an emergency arises, even though you've drained your B-level batteries, you can respond and you can act appropriately and take care of the situation and then deal with it later for a week or 2 as you can't really get out of your chair or think about anything and you're trying to recover. This is very confusing for people observing us, and it makes it look like, oh, you're faking it. I just saw you yesterday, you had no trouble with that, and now you're telling me you can't. Or you do it anyway, and now you can't walk. Why are you telling me you can't walk as a result of that small activity that you did yesterday with no trouble? So that's a very popular topic in people writing, is saying, thank you. Not only did it explain to them what's happening so that they can plan ahead and be successful working around this problem, but it also helps them to explain to others what is happening to them. And I'll mention now, since nobody ever talks about this in neuroscience, that Debbie Zelinsky, Dr. Zelinsky, in fact, sent me a link to a neuroscience news article. And I'd like to read you just a couple of points in this because I think these may be connected. And this may come up later in the interview if we talk about the overlap of cognitive science and neuroscience. It says here, and I'm quoting the article, the online article, researchers at Medical University in Vienna have discovered that neurons have an emergency backup system to enable them to remain functional even when their energy supply is disrupted. The emergency backup system follows a hierarchy. As the researchers also observed, deployment of the, and I'm skipping ahead, deployment of the neuronal emergency backup system follows a hierarchy. While the first two regulatory mechanisms share their backup duties, the third only comes into play if the two fail to function adequately. One reason for not pulling on this backup system very often is that it is very likely that deployment of system number 3 goes hand in hand with an adverse side effect, explains Helmut Kubista. Now, I don't know if this is the same, vehicle that we're talking about, but I have to be suspicious that it is. Anyway.
Yeah, that sounds quite similar. And just a couple comments on the batteries. Yeah, my family members who read the book, that was one of the biggest things they brought up as being better, helped them to understand what I was going through more. And also, I feel like as a patient, those batteries were what took up every decision of my day, was trying to figure out which level of battery I was currently in and how much more I could take on, and that very fine line between each of the A, B, and C batteries, to try and not dip down into that deepest level. So
yes. Well, yes, and I'm sorry you had to go through it, but I'm glad that maybe the book did help at least to manage it, and at least for others to understand what was happening to you. So many have written about that, which of course was a surprise to me. But all right, so another theme that comes up often is that they are not alone. That this is so troubling for so many. That they write and say that this was the biggest thing to me, is that it's the first time I realized that others are suffering this same kind of bizarre transformation in their lives. And that although I don't see them in my life, I can go out and find them. And this is made worse because so many of those with head injuries are faking it to get by. They're faking it so they can keep their job, or faking it so that they can get by in the family without seeming like a weird mental case. And so it's not going to be easy to come across others that are experiencing the same symptoms. So I think that was very helpful to know that they're not alone, and that these are common symptoms that many people are experiencing. And they'll say things like, I can't believe that you understand what happened to me. You're the first person who ever described my symptoms and understood this. And tears just started flowing down my face when I read the passage, and so on. All these years have gone by, and somebody finally acknowledges that this is what happened to me, and that it's happened to others too, and I'm not a crazy person. And of course, I feel so badly that they have had to go so long before having some connection with others. But at least they could find that. And so, good that has happened. And let's hope that we can find so many others who are still going through exactly that same kind of isolation and loneliness. Another theme that's related is the validation of their experience. Some form of, this is me, I'm reading my life in the pages of your book. For the first time in a year, 5 years, 20 years, there's finally some validation of what has happened to me. One woman wrote, I think she said, I went storming back to my neurologist's office, taking a copy of your book, and said, read this here. I was right and you were wrong. I was right all along. I'm not a crazy person. This is what's happened to me.
mm-hmm.
And many people do, I think, have that that feeling of that finally some of this is making sense, and that they were correct in their assessment of what was going on with them.
Right. It's so hard when you're when you haven't recovered to put those things into words and to verbalize. And so the fact that you're able to reflect on it from the other side really helps everyone explain what's going on in their head.
Yeah. Another issue that people write about is balance. I do have a fairly healthy section in Ghost where I discuss balance problems. And we have to remember that the integration of proprioception in the body, the visual spatial processing, starting with the retinas and then working through the spatial centers in the brain, our hearing, and then our inner ear balance systems, these all work together. So when we have an assault to the brain, which you'll probably hear me talk about later, is I think primarily an issue with damaging the visual spatial processing in the brain. When we have that kind of assault, it can very much affect our balance, and also in strange ways. So one thing that people responded to was saying, Elliott, you're exactly right. I don't have any balance problems going to class, let's say. But then I'm sitting in class and I'm trying to take notes. And then after class, I can hardly stand up. I can't walk down the hall without putting my hand on the wall to keep from falling over. That my balance is fine until I start thinking, and then I fall over. Well, I can explain this. And I do explain some of it in the book. And that is that our balance systems have at least three main aspects to them. One, of course, is the inner ear, which keeps us upright using those three semicircular canals, that network of semicircular canals that literally have fluid flowing over these little tiny hairs in them that are detecting whether we're moving in the three different directions in space and sending immediate signals to the brain about how to keep us upright. And you'd say, well, how can your balance system be affected just by thinking? That's not going to change how that fluid is flowing over those tiny hairs inside your semicircular canals. And that's true, but it can affect your balance in the following way, that your visual system is also critical in helping us to stay upright and also maintain a balanced view of the world around us. So if you want to try this little experiment, we won't do it now, but those listening can try it. Stand on one foot with your eyes open and feel what's happening in the bottom of your foot. And you'll see these, minor adjustments as your foot's correcting to keep you upright. Now close your eyes and see what happens. All of a sudden your foot's going like this, if you can stand up at all. And what's happened is you've removed the visual input that is looking at the world, keeping you upright by detecting slight changes in the horizon and sending signals to your brain about how to adjust for that to keep you upright. So that's an easy way to see how obvious it is that the visual system is also contributing to staying upright and our balanced view of the world. And then proprioception, when we feel things in our body, it's in the context of understanding that we're placed in the 3D space around us, and the differences between the world outside and where that world ends and our world begins, that is the us that we think of as ourselves. And that's all visual spatial processing, even though it's sensory proprioceptive input, muscle input, and spinal changes that have to respond to that. But it's also visual spatial in nature. So when you go to class and you're thinking, trying to understand concepts, you're taxing those visual spatial systems in our brain just by thinking, because this is the nature of what makes us human, is these visual spatial symbol manipulations. Well, if your brain is having trouble with that, you're going to get tired, and that visual spatial processing starts to degrade. Then you go to stand up after class, and even though the fluid's still flowing in your ears and your eyes are still open, you can't interpret what you're seeing through your eyes in the same way. And when you feel things in your body as your body moves and you're trying to interpret the signals coming from your ears within 3D space, that's not working right either, because the target of that input is this visual spatial processing, and that's been compromised by thinking. And just thinking can make it very difficult to stand upright. And then furthermore, when you don't have a balanced view of the world, you can't think correctly. And here's an example. So Emily, think of your mother and just visualize your mother out there. All right. And then imagine an uncle or an aunt. And if you don't have one, imagine that your mother has a brother or a sister. All right. So now point to where your mother is in the space in front of you there. Okay. Now point to where your aunt and uncle are, or uncle. All right. Virtually everybody is going to do that. They're up because they're greater than us. We've known them as adults when we're small, our parent. And then in a sideways relationship, there's our aunt or there's our uncle, and it's sideways up and then sideways to get there. This is visual spatial processing. So when you're trying to take notes in class, and this is not working correctly because your balance starts to go for the reasons I just mentioned, you don't know which way is up. And you don't have the same sense of which way is to the right because you're losing upness and downness and side to side, which all comes as part of the balance system. And then furthermore, of course, we could get into all of these VORs, which are the tiny movements thousands of times a minute as we're keeping our eyes focused on something in the distance, which depends on a healthy balance system. So I'll just say this, then I'll stop. Don't get me started, right? So Emily, take a look at my finger right here.
Okay.
All right. And now notice that as far as and follow my finger, as far as you can tell, it's just a very smooth movement. No problem. Your eyes are just following my fingers. Yes. But
Pretty
you can only do that because you have a sense of 3D spatial world and there's motion. So you're performing the pursuit, which all happens as part of this visual spatial retinal processing in the brain. All right, now do the same thing, follow my finger, but now twist your head around as you follow it. So now you're making all these balanced spinal adjustments. So you have no problem following my finger or a bird in flight when you're walking down the street. All right, so you can imagine what happens when visual spatial processing gets, taxed and has been damaged. And 1,000 times a minute, you're trying to make those micro adjustments that you can no longer make efficiently. It is just exhausting. And hence, why balance is such a critical issue. And so many don't realize how it's affecting all aspects of their lives. Even if they don't feel that they're losing their balance, they're losing their balanced thinking for the same reasons. So balance was a big one. People did write about various aspects of it that I talked about.
Yes, I didn't have as many vestibular issues, but I know what you mean about following your finger. When I move my head, I can do it, but it might provoke nausea or fatigue.
Right.
So I was having balance issues perhaps, but didn't know it.
Well,
So
and how about, brain fog and fuzziness, especially when you were fatigued from having to think and focus on something? Did you have that?
Yes, I had that as well. So I think the kind of overall theme of what you've just discussed from a big picture perspective is just the concept that most people have no idea that their eyes are doing all of these amazing things. And so when we think about recovery, it's not as obvious that seeing a neurooptometrist like Dr. Zielinski, for example, might help us in so many ways that we, wouldn't have otherwise expected or known.
Right. And we can imagine how hard it is to make that jump when a person is feeling, I don't know what's wrong with me. I'm just not the same. And they're burning things in the kitchen that they never used to, or they can't understand what people are saying to them. Now try to get that person to pull out of the ether in the way that I sort of did, having thought about this while, taking all those notes in the book as an AI scientist. Try to get them to make the leap. Oh, well, the problem is when I'm thinking that's visual spatial processing, that gets fatigued, which is now affecting my balance in ways that I don't realize, which is now leading to brain fog because I can't manipulate symbols in an internal balanced way. And the word balance never occurs to them. All they know is I don't feel right anymore. So yeah, this is a challenge. And so many, I think, found that helpful to say, this all makes sense. It's finally making sense to me, what's happening to me. And they would try to protect their balanced view of the world and protect their balance, even just as they move through the world, and hoard those resources, and it helped them with their thinking and brain fog.
Yeah, and one other theme we haven't discussed yet, but we've mentioned in the past, is the theme of hope. So maybe if you want to touch on that in your correspondence.
Yes, absolutely, Emily. This is a common theme among readers, that for the first time since the onset of their symptoms, sometimes even decades prior, they felt that there was hope for them. If I could live through a parallel nightmare described in words that they so well did understand, And I came out all but fully healed, and maybe even better than healed, having addressed some other issues that I had prior to the brain injury, um, and could document this in the book that they're reading, then, you know, they have hope, at least for some of us, even if it's not for them themselves. They'd like to feel that somebody could get better. And you think, well, people are mostly just self-centered and worried about they want to get better. And that's true, of course. We have to advocate for ourselves. But you'd be surprised how cheered there so many people are that someone else that had these symptoms and has been told you'll never get better, you're going to have to live with it, nobody ever recovers, that some of others can get better, and that cheers them. So it's sort of a dual hope, and it makes you feel good about humanity when people write that, to say, I don't know if I can get better, but I'm so happy that others, and I can live vicariously through them, that they got better. And then, of course, they feel like maybe I could get better too if I seek these same kinds of retinal processing treatments. And then, of course, so many of them did.
Yes. Well, and I think also the concept that someone like you took the time to write this book so that you know even if just one person got better from all the work you put in, I think that also gives readers hope as well, that there are good people
Yes.
like you out there wanting to give back.
Well, and obviously what you're doing now. So thank you for that. And I'm just, I was trying to honor the work of Dr. Zelinsky and Dr. Marcus, who are the brilliant drivers of these vehicles that work for so many, have worked for so many. So, but thank you for that.
Right.
I don't count. I mean, from my perspective, I'm just a guy who got unbelievably lucky and got better. And I took some notes and I wrote them down. And the real heroes here, obviously, are Debbie Zelinsky, Donnelly Marcus, and others on whose shoulders they are standing.
Right. Well, you're very humble. I think us other TBI survivors view you as quite the hero as well. But I think that's a great segue into discussing more about the recovery itself and more about both of these doctors. So if you want to give a little overview of
Sure.
finding them and kind of the initial experience of working with them and what they do.
Sure. Emily, can I pause just a minute and take 40 seconds to name 3 other categories without describing them, but that were very common, because it might be meaningful
Oh,
for
great.
people who are.
Mm-hmm.
One was that so many loved ones wrote and said, oh my gosh, I can't believe how much I have misunderstood what happened to the person that is close to me. And this was so helpful that now I can have a real dialogue with them. So that was good. And of course, the saddest cases are those when someone committed suicide because of just, life was so hard after the head injury. And the guilt that parents and brothers and sisters feel like they should have done something. And reading the book seemed to help them understand there's really nothing you could have done. I mean, maybe it would have been helpful if we discovered some of these treatments in time, but it's not bad parenting or being a bad brother or sister. This was a physical assault to the brain beyond your control and beyond their control. So I think loved ones is an important category to mention. And then, of course, many wrote that they recovered. They sought these treatments and they recovered. And then, a big one is, that they were not feeling just not human, that they were an alien. They were alien to the human race because they'd been so very, very much altered. Okay.
Thanks for going over those last few. And yes, I have many, many more underlined and note taken, but I fear we could talk for many, many hours about that.
So you asked, Emily, about working with Dr. Marcus and Dr. Zelinsky, and commonly Zelinsky is called Dr. Z fondly, and Donnelly goes by Donnelly rather than Dr. Marcus. She said, oh, just call me Donnelly. So I may fall into that here, and occasionally Debbie for Deborah Zelinsky. So I lived with my condition for almost a decade, as you have noted, and I reached the point where I couldn't keep going anymore. Well, almost a decade, 8 years anyway. I was on the verge of becoming a ward of the state. The best doctors I could find were all unanimous. I would never get better. And I saw doctors, for example, that were consulting on $10 million sports contracts and saw very, very famous figures that people around the world know. And these were the kinds of doctors I was seeking out. Can you help me? And they were unanimous. Nobody ever gets better from this kind of head injury. You'll get better at learning to work around your symptoms, like that you can't walk, you can't think, you can't sleep, you can't read sometimes, and so on. So that was not the best news. In a last gasp effort, really a last gasp effort, where I was just hanging on by my fingernails at that point, I found Dr. Donnelly Marcus and Dr. Deborah Zielinski. Each treats brain injuries and other brain difficulties, as most will know, by working through the retinas and taking advantage of the plastic nature of the human brain. That is, that the brain is continually reconfiguring itself, and it does this throughout life. And they take advantage of this by pushing our brains in a certain direction to reconfigure it back toward normal health, and primarily, I think, normal visual spatial processing. You know how it is. Every other medical professional, pretty much, at least at that time, always just wanted me to go away because I made them uncomfortable. They couldn't help me. It's like, well, yeah, but could you maybe go away now, because I can't do anything for you, and you don't like that, and I don't like that. So if you walk out of my office, I don't have to deal with it anymore. And there's this great moment that I still remember after I met with Donnelly. She called me back and said, come in. I've got a plan. I know how we're going to work with this. And then right away, she said, I also want you to go see Debbie Zielinski, which is how I was introduced to her. And I remember very clearly Dr. Zielinski walking out of the room after my first appointment with her. And then she's looking back over her shoulder, and she smiled, that beautiful smile of hers, and said, I know what's wrong with you, Clark, and I know how to fix it. And then she walked away to her other patients. For her, this was no big deal. But for me, this was like a bombshell of hope going off in my life. I mean, nobody had ever spoken with any kind of confidence like that before. In my cases, in many cases, they were wildly successful. Not only did they get me functioning at a very high level again, but they also fixed some attention difficulties that I had prior even to having the head injury, some attention oddities. I never had ADD or ADHD, but I tended a little bit that direction on the spectrum. That got significantly better as well. So I was better even than prior to the accident, after I got through with these brilliant doctors. In practical ways, I was fully recovered after 6 months with the puzzles and 2 years with the glasses. So I'm smarter, calmer, happier, I'm more focused, I'm more productive, and have lots more energy than really ever I have been. There are a few minor things, not even worth mentioning, that have persisted, completely minor. And I would say I am fully recovered and remain fully recovered without going back for further treatment. I've not worked on the puzzles for years. I worked on them for 6 months, but I still wear the glasses every day. I wear them, when I drive. So as long as I'm getting out in the car, then I'll get some time with my brain glasses here. Which was a problem with COVID, because I noticed myself getting a little fuzzy because I'm working all the time on the computer, and I don't wear the glasses when I'm sitting in front of the computer. So I'm putting in these long hours, getting all my courses online for my students at DePaul, and realized I was getting a little fuzzy. And then I finally dawned on me, I need at least 2 or 3 minutes a day with these glasses. And I just started wearing them for a few minutes in the morning, and that was enough. So we must keep in mind that these doctors are getting these intractable cases. They're getting the walking wounded that no one else can deal with, and everybody else has given up on them. And with that kind of a population coming in the door, even a 15% success rate would be fabulous. But they're having much, much more success than 15%. And the secret is they're working to address these visual spatial processing difficulties in the brain that are the root of many of these problems, and very few others are doing that.
Yes, and I wonder if you could take a minute to, you talked about the cognitive puzzles from Donnelly, just so others out there can kind of get an idea of the level of work. Can you comment on kind of how frequently you did those puzzles and maybe, generally how much time you put in?
Yes, I can.
I know
And
each case is different, but
yes, and absolutely, we need to be clear about this. Well, let me be clear about a couple of things. First, I am not a practitioner, a health practitioner in any way. So take what I say with a grain of salt, of course. And I'm not an MD. I've never had any medical training. So I'm just a guy and I'm sharing some ideas here. And I certainly have thought a lot about this, and I do have all my AI training. But I want to be clear about that. I'm just somebody talking about my experiences and the people that I have met. And that's important to note. And second, there's a much bigger operation now at the Mind Eye Institute and Dr. Zelinsky's work. So there's more publicity about that than there is about Donnelly's work. And Donnelly still works out of her basement office primarily and manages everything herself. So it's a smaller operation in that way. But from my perspective, absolutely both of these treatments were critical in my getting better. That Donnelly's work was every bit as important to me as was the work with the Mind Eye Institute and Debbie Zelinsky. And the puzzles, I worked on them diligently for 6 months. I saw Donnelly 13 times. That would be every 2 weeks. And I worked on the puzzles pretty much every day. And I would say about an hour a day, and for a total of maybe 10 hours a week. So some days I couldn't work on them because I'm taking care of my kids often as a single parent and raising this baby and trying to keep my job and manage all the things we do in our daily lives as adults. So some days I couldn't work on the puzzles because they were hard work and I would be tired after working on them. But at the same time, in those first 6 months, I was recovering. So I did have energy that I used and I put it in on the puzzle. So that was a hard hour each day or two. And I really pushed myself to work on them. Keep in mind, I was still compromised, even though I was significantly better. And these puzzles were a challenge and I made them harder. So Donnelly would
I
give me
remember
these
that in the book.
these dots puzzles. And, after a few months, I'm working these puzzles with 120 dots on them. And I'm staring at them, getting these 3D images to rise out. Now, I might spend 20 minutes just to get one box to come out of the dots. And then I'd lose it. And then I'd keep working on it. After a few days, I could get that box and a pyramid to come out, and then I could get them both at the same time. And I worked at it till I could get the entire page to float out of the dots, and I could see all of them moving from one to the other and back again. And that drove Donnelly nuts. She commented, "Need I remind you that you have a motor skill problem?" Which was kind of an inside joke because when I first saw her, she said, "Draw this figure," and I'm saying, "Okay, Donnelly, this isn't going to go well. And I need to see it." So it's just a little drawing, a line drawing, and I'm curled up sideways trying to, the paper's all scrunched up in my hand. I look like I'm having a neurological breakdown. Almost ended up on the floor, and Donnelly's, her helper in the background is, do I dial 911? Should I call the hospital? It was just my voice saying, "Don't worry about it. This is normal. It always happens." So that was the inside joke, is yes, I needed to connect my thinking to my motor coordination. Uh, but I did do it all in my head because I needed that work for the kind of visualization I did when working on these hard AI problems. And then at the end, then I would draw them all out by hand. So I think there's no other way to say this other than the puzzles are hard work. And keep in mind, especially, that Donnelly is going to find the parts that are weakest and say, this is what you need to fix. And with head injuries, this is a common theme, is that the parts of us that are dispositionally weaker than others, those are the parts that are going to break down first, because all the workarounds we've used through our lives to compensate for that weak part of our own processing are now gone. In my case, because of the slight attention difficulties, she gave me many of these puzzles where I had to figure out what's the rule and then follow the rule. Like, here's some objects, here's another object, find all that have the same shape, a different orientation, and a different color. Well, I figured out how to do these in about 5 minutes. And they said, well, Donnelly, these are boring. You know, I've already figured out how it all works. In fact, I corrected a couple of her puzzles, which was sort of funny, right? She said, I didn't notice that. I've had these puzzles for 10 years and you're the first one ever found that error in them. So she said to me, said, well, so what? It's not about whether you're bored or whether it's interesting to you. It's about you learning to develop this voice that says, what's the problem? What's the rule? What's the solution that follows the rule? And then executing the solution following the rules. Well, I didn't like doing this. I've skipped ahead. I figured out I could write a computer program to generate these puzzles already after the first day. And she said, so what? Do the work. So I would want people to know, if they're working on Donnelly's puzzles, that it is work and she's going to find the parts that are weakest. But it's such a joy when you fix these things. And boy, what a godsend in my life to learn, oh, well, you can, you know, jump ahead and have this chaos because you know what the rule is, but it's too boring to follow it. And maybe you're smarter than some other people, so you can work around this way. You don't have to do it that way. It's like, oh my gosh, the result is chaos. And so many people, for example, that have trouble following rules will find reasons why the rule is stupid. But calm, orderly people have the choice. They might not follow the rule because it is a stupid rule and they want to do something better, but they have a choice. Oh, but if I want to, I'll just follow the rule, and it's easier than fighting against it all the time because I can't pursue that process. So the puzzles that Donnelly gives, I think they're very effective. They work from the bottom up. And I maybe could talk about that a little bit later if you want, the theory behind how these work. And I wouldn't want anyone to feel discouraged if they're working on the puzzles and it's hard for them, because it was hard for me. It's also kind of fun because you get better and you figure out how to get the puzzles done, and then they're not a problem anymore. And of course, for me, just the fabulous beauty of being able to see again, to understand what a triangle is, just drawing 3 dots and understanding now, oh, wait, I get that. Can I digress for a minute and say how these puzzles work, or you want to leave that for later?
Yeah, maybe let's say we'll go into a little bit deeper with the science behind both at the end.
Okay.
But I think that's really helpful, just sort of summarizing, you know, how much you put in and that it was a challenge. And, you know, that's been helpful for me to hear as well.
So let me summarize.
Okay.
I worked at them almost every day that I could, which was almost every day for 6 months, diligently. They were hard and I worked hard at them. And they were tiring. I was tired after doing them each time. So I had to plan in my day when I could get them done and still function as a parent and a professor and so on. And we don't know that my trajectory is going to be the same as someone else's, but I found them effective. And I think lots of other people have found them very effective as well. And some of the time, the results I've seen with others, they work on one set of puzzles and all of a sudden a speech oddity gets corrected. They've had this their whole life and they're working on these puzzles, something changes in their visual spatial processing. And even in a short amount of time, within a week, 10 days, that something has gotten better. And I asked Donnelly about this and she said, well, sometimes we see that. Absolutely. So.
Thank you. And I think one thing to note too, is some of these changes are quite subtle. And so, just because you don't feel like you can tell something, you know, in a few weeks doesn't mean that your brain isn't improving and changing, but it might take more weeks or months to kind of be able to reflect back and really understand, you know, in what way you've improved. So I think that's another motivation to, you know, keep working hard, even if you don't quite see the progress yet.
Right. Do the work. And you can trust these brilliant clinicians, you know, Donnelly, absolutely, that she has psyched you out, and just the way your foot's turned out or the way your pinky is sitting on the desk, she said, I've seen that. I know what we got to work on here. And I should comment also that the glasses were hard work too. I mean, I felt good right from the start that I'm headed in the right direction. But keep in mind, even that first pair of glasses with which I felt so phenomenally successful after, you know, like after a month, I was wearing the glasses maybe 3 weeks and I'd worked on the puzzles for a month. I was at that point thumbnail 70% recovered after 8 years in the soup, Um, but times wearing those glasses, I couldn't walk. My body's contorted in this way like a baby discovering the world. And literally I would have to dance down the hallway at DePaul because I couldn't walk. I couldn't walk, but I could dance. Or I'm trying to get my door open and I can't put the key in without turning upside down, trying to, I'm marveling at this world that's exploding again for me. And I'm trying to learn to process all this input that I didn't have access to before, but it was work. So the glasses were work too.
Right.
And, and sometimes they won't be the right glasses. I mean, in my case, they were, but I know that some of the time it's like, we tried this, now we're getting feedback on what happened and we have to adjust. So I would want people to know it's not magic. And sometimes they're going to have to backtrack and try something different. I think that that's very reasonable to expect that. So the
Right.
glasses will work and the puzzles will work. I worked at it.
Right. It's not necessarily a linear path, and sometimes it might take feeling more uncomfortable while your brain's figuring out the new pathway before it gets more comfortable.
Right. But as I mentioned, in my case, comfort is an odd word because I felt that I was waking up and that it was right. But
Right.
that doesn't mean it wasn't a challenge. Well, oh my God, the third glasses, I hated those. I hated those, but I knew that that was the right work to do. She took away the crutches of the prisms that were in my second pair. And then that third pair without them, where she was forcing me to balance the world, said, no, they're right. That's what we need. Yeah, that was a lot of work. Took me a year till I could really put the time in on those and get that right.
Yeah. Well, maybe let's talk one kind of theme that also relates to Dr. Z and the science is you talked about, with the injury, not feeling human at all and kind of what makes us human and how you were able to get that back. So if you want to maybe speak on that a minute, that would be great.
Yes. And as I alluded to earlier, this was a common theme that people wrote about, this feeling of being an alien. And it's, not just from head injuries. I hear the same thing from people with long COVID cases and people who had strokes and lack of oxygen from being in a hospital with pneumonia, that they are all reporting this oddity. It's like, well, I know that I used to live here, but I'm not here anymore. And I'm not like other people, even though they can't tell. But the me that used to be me is gone. Mm-hmm. And I feel like an alien that just kind of dropped into my body. So I can talk a little bit about the theory here. And from my perspective, not working in the field, but observing it, let's just put this at a theoretical level. But it's extremely common for visual spatial processing to be compromised from a head injury or other cognitive assault to the brain, including emotional trauma, by the way, with chemical flooding. But visual spatial processing is at the very core, Emily, of what makes us human. It's the basis for all thought and the manipulation of symbols in our brains that gives meaning to the sensory input that we're interpreting. It allows us to imagine tomorrow and the day before yesterday. It allows us to see ourselves as a unique entity in relationship to the rest of the world. So it's the basis for all thought, self-awareness, understanding language, motor control. It allows us to move our bodies. It's the basis of sensory awareness, a major component, as mentioned, of our balance systems, placing ourselves proprioceptively in the space around us, and even for us to understand where we end and the rest of the world begins. And if visual spatial processing is damaged, much of this can disappear in the instant of the accident or the assault. And it's just gone. And we're left trying to have our humanness come back and inhabit something that's no longer there. We don't have the machinery that supports the magnificence of what a human being is. And of course, as readers of the book know, that was the ghost part that I ultimately, when I started getting put back together again and rebuilding this visual spatial processing, that I now had an instrument that could once again support me. And that was the ghost of me that had been, haunting off in the distance, but gradually coming closer. And finally, in that moment, flooding back into my body that could now support it again. So absolutely, this feeling of alienness is rampant in head injuries. And I believe from a theoretical perspective, it's because of damage to the visual spatial processing system that allows us to be human, and the fact that that has disappeared.
Great, thank you. And you mentioned these other, conditions such as recovering from a stroke or long COVID, or even something like Lyme disease, perhaps. Um, can you comment on sort of how those might be related, and whether these Dr. Z and Donnelly, treat those types of patients as well?
Absolutely. Emily, I will say, people write to me and say, literally, I don't have a brain injury, but I suffer from XYZ. And, XYZ could be something like, as you mentioned, emotional stress and trauma and the chemical flooding that comes from that, physical force trauma of a concussion. Excuse me 1 second here. It could be Havana syndrome, lack of oxygen from pneumonia, and they were in the hospital. They're not getting enough oxygen to their brain. Long COVID. All of these are cognitive breakdowns. And so the short answer is cognitive breakdown in the brain is cognitive breakdown. And so many of the symptoms that I describe in the book are also reported by people with all of these other conditions. And it's the same. I mean, they're reporting the same things. Now, obviously, there are differences with stroke and concussion, that there's going to be a different neurological overview, but the cognitive result is often very, very similar. And, so they'll say, I just want you to know that your book has explained to me for the first time all of the symptoms that I live with every day, even though it's this whole array of different causes. And I'm not a medical practitioner, as I said, but my absolutely strongest intuition, Emily, is that all of these people are suffering from these visual spatial breakdowns in the brain. And if so, then I would suggest that, yes, what Donnelly Marcus does and what Debbie Zielinski does through retinal stimulation and moving the brain through this beauty of brain plasticity into activating new channels in the brain that is taking over healthy real estate to perform visual spatial functioning that has gone missing, probably we should at least be suspicious that it could be very helpful for all of these people. So, I'm not a clinician. I'm a person speaking theoretically. I'm going over in my head what all of these people write to me and say, it's the same issue that you had. And I'm thinking, it works for head injuries. Why wouldn't it work for these other conditions as well? And I happen to know that, yes, they do treat, anecdotally, I know that they do treat many of these same kinds of conditions, regardless of what caused the assault to the brain.
Right. Yeah, I think it's very helpful from a broad macro perspective, just to think of the benefits of brain plasticity, and how a lot of these treatments can be quite similar regarding on what regardless of what caused your accident, or what type of neurological disease or incident you're suffering from.
And Emily, don't we have to ask, how many of these cases of COVID are leaving people with long-term changes that they're not really recognizing? That to them, it's like, well, I'm just kind of feeling off, or I got older, or it must be from stress at work. And in fact, no, it's from the COVID. You've got cognitive processing issues, and they can be addressed. And I don't know, there's certainly a large population that has gone through this. And I have to wonder how many have been affected and don't actually realize how much they have been affected and why.
Right. Well, hopefully this will give a lot of those out there hope to look for treatment and seek out providers like the two we're discussing. So I think while we're kind of on maybe more of the macro topic, I'd love to move into a little bit into your career now, your study of cognitive science. Maybe how your injury and recovery has impacted this study, if at all.
I think in two ways, and I'll keep this part short, but
Okay.
I could answer that in two ways. The first thing is that I'm acutely aware of how exceedingly complex even the simplest thoughts and actions are in a human being's life. For example, if I say, Emily, uh, think of what you had for breakfast yesterday. It's like, no big deal, right? Well, if we can remember it, and if not, we'll know pretty much where we were and what we might have had. Well, until having gone through this experience, I would not be thinking that a cognitive science rendition of what goes through your brain to retrieve the fact that, I don't know, we'll invent this, that you had toast and orange juice and, I don't know, guacamole, is that you have color processing that takes place as integrated with the memory. You have the concept of less than and greater than, because to think back to yesterday, we usually put that on a timeline of this is now our experience right now. If you look around, where's yesterday? It's not here. It's entirely fabricated in our brains. Well, we sequence that from before to now to after, and that requires the sub concept of less than and greater than, so that you can create that sequence. And of course, as pieces of this variously disappeared during this period of my head injury, I got a really, really close look at the fabulous amount of processing that we go through just to retrieve what we ate breakfast yesterday. The whole idea of perspective. Are we looking at ourselves eating breakfast, or are we looking at the breakfast in front of us? Most of us have already translated this into a story that we might be fabricating for the first time to answer that question. And we're looking at ourselves in the breakfast room or the kitchen eating breakfast, but we're watching as a third person observer from the distance. So all of that has to take place. And in the book, there was one passage that I really fought with myself back and forth and back and forth. Do I include this? Because it's somewhat agonizing to read, and it's fantastical. And it's the passage where I talk about what happens. This little test I would give myself in the morning is that I have to name my children. And at the time, there were 5. Now I have 6, but there were 5 children I had to go through. Well, that's a pretty simple task. And on a good day, it takes, 5 seconds to name your children, right? You would expect this of a responsible parent. And on bad days, it would take me 3 minutes or more. And even then, I wasn't sure if I'd named them correctly. So I go through the process of activating working memory to keep the idea of less than and greater than, and parts that I could understand, parts that I couldn't understand. The idea of thumbs looking like faces and a handful of thumbs. It's a collection of things. And that not only is there the, ordinality process of numbers, right? That's just that you have a sequence, and that requires less than and greater than. If you go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, that 2 is greater than 1 and 3 is greater than 2, but also the idea of a collection of things, the cardinality. And so I'm struggling with, well, first I have to get the cardinal idea of how many there are in the set of my children. And then I have to get an ordering, because we typically think of children with ages, and then the ordering would help me to make sure that I didn't forget anyone. And so now I'm having to explore the concept of ordinality versus cardinality in numbers, and less than or greater than is a component of sequence, and colors being involved with the memory. And oh my gosh, to see what a brain has to go through just to perform a simple task of remembering what your children are. And keep in mind, in that book, I only included, I don't know, 1/6 of the actual notes of the detail that we go through. And I believe that every minute of the day, every second of the day, we go through all of this kind of processing at super speed under the hood, and we don't realize it. So the first thing I would answer is understanding how exceedingly complex the mechanism of being human is, and the brain that supports our humanness. And typically nobody will ever think about this, but I was forced to. And then, as mentioned, I became acutely aware of how important visual spatial processing is in every aspect of who we are. And it's the core of manipulating symbols, which, for example, allows us to translate the sound of speech into the tokens of thought that become collections of symbols that create meaning. So even though we think, oh, well, it's just hearing, I said, no. If I tap a wine glass, it is an example I use, I tap a wine glass behind your right shoulder, you're immediately translating that into the image, the spatial image of that's glass. It has a certain kind of reflectance. There's wine in the glass. It's about half full because I can tell from the sound. It's 45 degrees off my right shoulder and so on. And that all of this visual spatial processing is necessary just to interpret that moment of what we hear. So that would be the second thing, is the complexity of visual spatial processing and how crucial it is in what makes us human.
Great. Yeah, that's
And of course,
very
why Debbie Zielinski and Donnelly Marcus are on the right track and why they can be so successful.
Yeah, and so that leads to me to my next question of, how does sort of advancements or research in cognitive science, the things that you're talking about, how does that influence, medicine and neurology, and maybe a bit about that lag? Because as other, survivors know out there, it's hard to find doctors who can help, but in some ways it seems like the science is there. And so if you could comment on that, that'd be great.
Yes, and this can be frustrating, and I'm sure it was frustrating for you. Is that correct? That it could be
Yes, I
frustrating?
mean, it obviously, you think the neurologists are going to be able to cure you because they study the brain, but again, there's the disconnect between what you study, and what a doctor goes through in medical school.
That's right. And first thing I think we must make clear is that there's a huge difference between neuroscientists, which and I count Debbie Zielinski and Donnelly Marcus as a branch of neuroscience, and that's closest to what I do as a cognitive science and an AI scientist. But there's a very distinct difference between neuroscientists and neurologists. Neuroscientists are generally research PhDs who are interested in the leading edge hard data that describes the structure and function of the central nervous system. And they're examining the smallest, tiniest effects in the lab, and with these fine scans that we're now getting in some cases, to understand the actual mechanics of how this unbelievably complex system works. I mean, the brain is, after all, by far the most complex system in the known universe that we've ever encountered. And by contrast, neurologists are not in that business. They have medical school training that neuroscientists don't have, and they're primarily interested in, well, saving your life. Their work is in diagnosing and treating disorders based on the way it's been done before and the hard data of the established medical science. And they're not free really to try, let's try this experimental treatment or this other experimental treatment, because it could put their practice at risk. They work with primarily with medications and diagnosis of how they can treat from an allopathic MD perspective, treat known diseases of the brain, or explain to people what has happened to them with stroke and tumors in the brain and so on. Those are not the same fields at all. And to go to a neurologist and expect a neuroscience background and a neuroscience ethos is a mistake, because it won't be there. I mean, there's only so much time you have in your life, and neurologists have the burden of making sure they not only save you if they can, but also don't kill you along the way. But regarding the overlap of neuroscience, which is close to to my work, closer anyway, in cognitive psychology, this is a huge area, and I'd have to say I'd be doing a disservice to those that have dedicated their lives to this exhausting grunt work of gathering the data and thus moving the science forward if I pretended to speak as an authority. So I won't. But I can speak about a general design where aspects of what we see in cognitive science should and can raise questions that can be pursued in neuroscience. So could I give a couple of examples how this might work?
That'd be great.
Okay, so let's see, we talked about the batteries metaphor, for example, that I used in the book. And the idea of the metaphor is, if you use the battery, the A batteries, your brain's going to get tired and it has to recover. And ditto for the B, but over a longer period, and for the C over an even longer period of maybe a week or two. but come on, we know the brain's not a muscle. So why are we using, excuse me, terms in the metaphor like getting fatigued in various recovery periods as though it were? I mean, muscles you could see getting really exhausted, and a major league pitcher getting worn out and needing a couple weeks to recover if they really overdid it and so on. But the brain is not a muscle. So this raises some very good questions that neuroscientists might then want to answer. On one hand, I'm giving this metaphor that it was so meaningful to so many people that have suffered from brain injury. So we have a lot of anecdotal evidence that this is what's happening to people. And so why can a concussive have no problem making these photocopies at 11 in the afternoon and then terrible trouble making them 2 hours later? We can observe that this happens and then raise the question, why? What's the neurological basis for this? And then it's exciting that someone comes along and says, well, it turns out that we have backup systems, but if you use for neurons, but if you use them, there's going to be side effects that take time from which side effects from which you have to recover, and that can take time. And once again, I don't know that this is connected, but I'm suspicious that it might be. But the point is that the batteries metaphor is a cognitive science approach to, well, it could be that we can test this in cognitive science running experimental psychology studies to isolate this effect. And having found that effect, this then can lead, to guide what we might want to do with neuroscience. Another issue is the left brain and right brain problem. And this was a real problem for me when I put this in the book, because the absolute rule, and I fought endlessly with the editor about this, was whatever happened, and when I wrote down the details of it, that's exactly what has to go in the book. We cannot change what happened. And the fights would be about, well, it would be easier to understand if we could change it this way. Or the narrative flow would go better if you could kind of alter the time and change it in this other direction. And I said, we can't do it. We can't do it. It has to be exactly what happened. And then the whole section on recovery from my diary entries is quite coarse. But those were the diary entries. And I said, we can't change them. They have to go in the way they were. I cleaned up spelling or something like that. But beyond that, it had to be verbatim. And I think that was actually, as a side note, was a really good choice, because I was expecting, especially with the medical community, to take a lot of heat about the book and say, well, we don't really believe you. But what I hear overwhelmingly is the level of detail is so overwhelming that how can you not believe that this is what actually happened? So I think that was a good decision. But here's where the problem came up. When I got my first pair of glasses, this pie slice over here on the left-hand side just opened up, and it was this magnificent, creative, beautiful, mysterious part of me that I think is my best aspect as an AI researcher, is coming up with new relationships and new ideas that no one else had thought of before. And it requires this kind of creative spirit that puts things together in an odd and unusual way that has rhythm and elegance to it. But it's kind of wacky. And that's what I felt come alive when I wore those first glasses that had the prisms in there and emphasized that part of who I was. It was on the left side, right brain, left side, creativity. By contrast, when I got my second pair a month later, that was my right-hand side. I could feel, put these on, oh, now this side opens up. And I still have some of the left, the creative part, but this was much less magical by comparison, but it was very practical and efficient, and I could get work done. So this had great value also, and of course was very important to me as an AI researcher. So now I'm looking at left brain, right-hand side, down to earth, logical, very obvious to me that this is what's going on in so many of the details of what I was seeing and how I was linking things together in the world. Left side, right brain, creative, fantastical, inventive, and kind of wacky, and dealt with things like rhythm and flow, and artistic sentiment, and thinking outside the box. Well, I know that the studies in experimental psychology have, poo-pooed this idea, that they say, well, we're not going to emphasize anymore. We don't really deal with left-handed people being so creative and right-handed people being more logical, and that's not in vogue anymore. So I think if I put this down in the book, which is what happened, and of course, that's exactly what I put in the book, because that's what happened, I'm going to be seen as this person that's believing in, well, you're kind of inventing that because we used to talk about it that way. But modern science shows, according to the data, that it's not true. Well, I think that neuroscience now can come to the rescue here and say, I don't know, we're getting a lot of people reporting this, and we can test in cognitive science. We put the glasses on, the descriptions, clear descriptions of people over and over again is that this is the creative part where I'm thinking, and this is the down to earth part. So now neuroscience may have to go back and say, what is causing this? What is the structure of the brain that, in fact, how can we see this differently, that we missed it with the original clinical the experimental psychological studies? What was wrong with the studies that we're not capturing this effect? So that would be a second case. And that interesting personal note that I'm feeling like, a lot of people are going to think I'm an idiot, and I will lose credibility, but it's got to go in the book. And then you have time for a couple short ones?
Yep.
All right. Another clear experience of mine was cognitive slowing, where I remember being tested once up in Northbrook, and I was supposed to look at some visual pattern on the screen and type the keyboard in response and type the keyboard. So started out, my response time was a second or 2 seconds as I was working through the examples. And then it got slower and slower. And at one point I'd forgotten what it was, but I think it might've been, it took me 5 minutes. I knew what the answer was, but it took me 5 minutes to get my hand moving over to push the key. And this would happen often, and others report this as well, is that just the world just starts moving in slower and slower motion. And yet I was observing all of this in real time. So this is a question that I think we can ask. And what is the neurological basis as studied by neuroscientists, not neurologists, neuroscientists, that allow us to have this breakdown? And in this case, there are lots of breakdowns, but in this case, the breakdown was the slowing, cognitive slowing. How can that occur when a second part of our brain is observing it in real time, such that later I could write down the notes? For example, spending over 3 minutes trying to figure out who my 5 children were. And if you read that passage in the book, I have extremely detailed notes of the processes that were going on in very, very, very slow motion. So what is that? Do we have 2 brains? I mean, you could say, well, it's not possible. If you were going that slow trying to understand who your children are, then you wouldn't be able to observe in real time and then later remember it and take notes of what was happening. So I think that's a good question. Decision making. In my experience, it's visual spatial in nature, is that we can do the work to figure out what is a good decision. And we typically think, well, once you've figured it out, then you make the decision based on what you've decided. No, that's not what happens. And this is very clear to me through my experience of living through it, is that they're different processes. One is you figure out what's optimal to some degree. Some people do a lot of that and some do a little of it. But separate from that is somehow you've laid out this visual spatial spectrum of the choice, and then you pick one. And in the same way that your hand will reach out and grab an object, you reach out and grab the decision. It's motion. Decision is visual spatial, sort of internal motor control almost. It's the same process. And so in the same way that my hand could not move to the keyboard, or you end up with catatonia, which is very common, where you can't move at all because of this visual spatial breakdown in the brain. You no longer have visual goals toward which you reach, and your body can't move. In the same way, you can't reach for decisions. So anyway, all of these can be tested by cognitive science. And when they're shown to be true as an effect through experimental psychology or whatever, then neuroscience, all the extremely detailed low-level work of how the neurons are interacting in this hugely complex system can then explore how does it work. Anyway, so I hope I didn't go too far afield there. So summary, I just mentioned left brain, right brain, the batteries metaphor, cognitive slowing, and the fact that we can observe it, even decision making, and how that's visual spatial in nature. And then, of course, what's the neuroscience basis for those effects?
Well, thank you. And that's really interesting. And I will be curious to follow newest neuroscience, research, and hopefully they'll be able to prove out and explain all of those things that you experienced in detail.
Right. And note that the neuroscience is so detailed. We're talking about hugely complex chemical processes at the molecular level. That's like analyzing the composition of a grain of sand in a brick, and we're trying to figure out how to build houses or buildings here. So it takes a while for that to percolate back up. But MDs and scientists rightly want, the hard science and the data that neuroscientists are providing. But a lot of this is going to be cognitive science driving the experimental psychology that could guide how what neuroscience maybe should focus on in some cases.
Right. And I think it's, I don't know if we've used the term clinically applied neuroscience or the acronym CAN, but that's exactly what Donnelly Marcus does in her practice. And I think for the patients out there looking for people who can help, the clinically applied neuroscience is
Yes.
kind of the most, cutting edge information that can be used to actually treat patients like you and I.
Yes. And related to that, working in parallel is what I'll call cognitive neuroscience, which is more theoretical and at a slightly higher level.
Okay.
Which would then guide how can the clinically applied neuroscience work. So we're looking at the bigger picture of things like that I describe in the book, and then trying to figure out what the neuroscience is of it and how to apply that. So I agree with you.
Great.
And you're doing a great job, by the way, Emily. These interviews are not easy, right?
Thank you, Clark. Well, I think just to go back to the Neuroplasticity Alliance for a minute and what Sherry and I are trying to do, we just want to reiterate that we're trying to help create awareness of and access to, and even ultimately the development of these neuroplastic treatments to help this wide range of neurologic dysfunction. So if you have any, advice for us out there, that we want to be as helpful as possible, and we are so appreciative, to all the years and time you've put into helping this community as well.
Thank you, and sure, and give me a sense of time. I can respond in two ways. One is how the theory of why these treatments that Debbie and Donnelly work. Just touch on that briefly. And then I can also talk about, as a whole, what's needed for this to move forward as a health community. There's a big stumbling block in the way right now, and I could talk about that as well.
That'd be great. Yeah, I think, we have a mix in our audience today of, patients, family members of patients, but then we also have a lot from the medical community. And so I think it's important, for a few minutes to go a little bit more into the science and how the community can move forward. And so
okay, well, that would fall naturally into, I have a little bit to say from a patient perspective. That would be theory of how it works, and that's, I think, fairly easy to understand. And then I have something to say from the medical community, the structure of the health community. Which would you like first?
Let's go into the science and theory first.
Okay, so and of course, Donnelly and Debbie are going to be the experts on this, and I hope you can get them on camera, and they will speak much more eloquently than I. But the issue here is that as mental beings, as humans, we are so exceedingly complex that when little things go wrong, it really throws a monkey wrench in the system. And I can give you an example. When we look at attention disorder for a while, and these head injuries can mimic that, often feeling very distracted, that from a retinal processing perspective, to me, it seems pretty obvious that some people are not getting that information from their peripheral vision, which is 93% of the visual space that's not that 7% of center focus. And if the two things can go wrong, either they're not seeing the context around them in the world, which is critically important in understanding how the world works. Like when you go shopping, you need to understand that there's a shelf of items, not just that there's a letter A on a paint can. There's shelves and there are paint cans, and you're in the right aisle. And if all you're getting is that letter A at the beginning of Abercrombie's, white paint, you're going to have a big problem. So one thing is that they're just not seeing it, and thus they have to move their eyes, their center vision, literally moving their eyes and their internal thinking to constantly use that center vision to figure out what the context is, and that's exhausting. Second thing that can happen is they're getting that information, but they can't integrate it with the central center focus. So the breakdown is rather they're getting the information, but it's not getting to where it's the destination needed to make use of it. So when that peripheral processing is gone, all of a sudden life just becomes completely chaotic because you're constantly having to not focus on what you're looking at or thinking about on everything else to try and figure out what the context is in which you're operating. And of course, Donnelly and Debbie work with that to integrate successfully get peripheral processing and then integrate it with the center processing. So that can be very helpful for people that are experiencing all this kind of fatigue and brain fog and kind of scatterbrain thinking all of a sudden. Another thing that could come up, and I'm just naming a couple to see how this works, is that with brain assault of one kind or another, something that might happen is that the near-far focus in one of our eyes has altered, and it's not operating as fast as it used to. So if you look in the distance, your lens is focusing in the distance, and then when you look up close, it's focusing up close. And we adjust this near-far focus, and you can just tell, you move your finger in and out, that not only are your eyes, the stereo vision, eyes moving in and out, but the focus of your lenses is changing. Well, stereo vision is really complex. I won't go into it. I could talk for 15 or 20 minutes. We talked about maybe doing a little presentation on that, but just interpreting a visual scene just requires quadrillions of pieces of information that we have to integrate. And now when you put two of these scenes together and they're slightly different and we have to figure out how to integrate them to get our 3D depth perception, it's a lot of work. Well, now what happens when your left eye, let's say, is lagging behind when you look in the distance, and it takes, I'm inventing this, but let's say it takes a half second longer to focus. Well, now the brain is flooded with one image in this horrendously computationally difficult problem, and we don't have computers even that can manage this, that the second image, which you're trying to integrate, is now out of focus for half a second. And then as soon as it gets back in focus and you're trying to catch up with that, you've looked somewhere else. And now you're going through the same problem where you come close and it's lagging coming up close. So the brain's response is, let's just turn off the input from that left eye because it's just too exhausting trying to integrate it. And the result would be something like, it's not that you don't see it, it's just you're not making use of the information. So maybe you're a student and you're trying to study physics, and that's where you need this 3D spatial reasoning in physics, and you can't do it because the brain's turned off half of it. You're not getting that exercise in the 3D spatial understanding of the world. Well, students don't know that. I mean, all they know is, well, they're not very good at physics, but they're really good at English and maybe algebra. That doesn't require that symbol processing as opposed to 3D spatial processing of physics. And then so they go through life, well, I like physics, but I'm no good at it. So, well, no. Zelinsky could address that fact to get your eyeball actually focusing near and far correctly. Now you can get an explosion of this whole rest of the world that everybody else has, which is 3D thinking. So that's something that could happen. Or how about flattening of affect? A lot of people with head injuries and these cognitive difficulties from whatever the source, the cause of their brain assault. They'll talk about flattening of affect, that their emotions have gone flat. Well, let's just take an example. Let's suppose that you have like a love triangle. I'll just pick a dramatic example. And this person, A likes B, but B likes C. And I don't know, C likes B or C likes A, one or the other. Well, if you're in that, you're expecting, well, I'm going to feel jealous or I'm going to feel concerned about the person who's jealous. And these would be normal human relationships. And not only, excuse me, are you not feeling these in the way you used to, you might be hearing about it or reading about it, and you don't have compassion for someone in the same way that you would expect to. So you feel weird, like an alien being that's no longer capable of supporting an emotional life. Well, so Donnelly, in my case, took me in and said, all right, let's see, you're working as an AI professor, you're a single parent, you're running this whole life, you're working on building your house. It's like, how do you manage all that? And I'm saying, I don't know. He says, because you can't understand any of it. And I said, yeah, it kind of feels like that. So we're going to start out with triangles. So I spent a week or 2 weeks just drawing triangles out of a series of dots. I had to find the triangles in the images. And at the end of that time, I felt like, oh, wait, I get it. Now I can see triangles again. And having seen triangles again, you can now understand there's a love triangle. And you're not thinking there's a triangle. You're just thinking of, well, now you understand jealousy. And I didn't myself happen to have emotional flattening, but it's very commonly reported. And this is a case where you're saying, you mean a silly puzzle where you're learning to connect the dots to form triangles out of a sea of dots. You're trying to get the triangles to rise out of the dots is going to give you back your emotional life. And said, well, it could, because if you can't see triangles, you can't understand emotions. So that's, another example. Just quickly, time and causality, trying to understand time and calendars, which is, very commonly goes out the window when people have these head injuries. But you can't understand that, the concept of time if you don't know, as I mentioned before, less than and greater than, smaller and larger, which allows you then to create a sequence. And of course, all of our metaphors for time are based on sequences. So now if you're asking me to understand next Tuesday, but I can't understand less than and greater than, I can't create the sequence that runs from now through the days of the weekend until next Tuesday. Donnelly can give you that back with puzzles where you say, okay, less than, greater than, less than, greater than, less than, greater than. Now a sequence of 3 things less than, greater than. So anyway.
Well, that's really helpful for linking, what you're doing in the homework to how it helps in the real life big picture. And I think even through what you were just saying just now, I learned a lot and will continue to motivate me to, do these puzzles and understand how it will affect the bigger outcomes. So I appreciate your explanation.
And put another way, if this is the problem, you can go to 10 years of talk therapy and cognitive behavioral therapy and trauma therapy, whatever, to try and get back your emotional life. But if you can't see triangles, you don't understand the difference between you and someone else, and you're not going to be able to support an emotional life. So fix the triangles.
Yes.
If that's the problem.
For all of you out there listening, I think hopefully we've provided a lot of helpful information on the benefits of seeing providers like Dr. Z and Dr. Marcus, and help you look for the clinically applied neuroscientists. Clark, I could talk to you about our shared experiences all day long, but is there anything else you'd like to leave the audience with that we haven't covered?
Well, I think there's probably some frustration that if these treatments work and they're almost magical in their effectiveness for people that are suffering from certain kinds of brain difficulties, why is it not propagating throughout the world, or at least the United States? And there are some structural difficulties why this is not moving forward as fast as we would like. Can I talk about that for a minute?
Great.
All right. So the first thing that it's like, there's the elephant in the room, is that we need evidence-based studies showing that these treatments are effective. And, these treatments have been, from my perspective, and those who've have gone through it are, been wildly successful. As we said, they're getting the hardest cases that nobody can fix. And so many of them are coming out either, somewhat improved or even fully healed in some cases. And I believe that, my book was so well received, as mentioned, because of all of the details. So scientists are not saying, oh, well, that's not worth anything. They're saying it's worth something. But in essence, it is really just a giant, detailed, decade-long case study of, an MTBI and recovery. It's just a case study. And medical insurance companies and MDs in general want empirical evidence based on modern science with controlled studies to show the effectiveness of these treatments. And, well, they should. That's how science works. I'm completely in favor of that. But the hard data on the effectiveness of retinal processing and brain plasticity, this is king. And without that hard data, we're not really going to move forward in the way that everybody would like. But Debbie and Donna Lee are brilliant clinicians, and they're in the business of restoring health to people and giving them back their lives. They are not in the business of doing the cold-blooded, scientific, detailed work of producing the hard evidence to show that these that these treatments work. And I do fear that their collected clinical knowledge is going to go when they're no longer here on the face of the earth, which, it's going to happen to all of us at some point. And we're not currently training professionals in neurodevelopmental optometry and cognitive restructuring psychology of the kind that Donna Lee does. And this is, there's a major reason for that. But that's what's needed, is brilliant young neuroscientists following these researchers around, along with research scientists at universities performing the actual data-driven studies showing the effectiveness of these treatments. And the structural problem in Debbie's case and Dr. Z's case, and also in Donna Lee's case, for a different reason, is that to prescribe glasses and even to measure the effects, of vision and comment on that for people for which they, a service they would pay for, you need to be a certified optometrist. But optometrists, by and large, are in the business of studying the eyes and glasses and lenses, and a few, they will be alerted to a few serious issues that can occur with the eyes to refer them to ophthalmologists. So they need all of this training, but they're not trained as neuroscientists, and by and large, they're not interested in the brain and neuroscience. On the other hand, we have the neuroscientists, brilliant young neuroscientists that would do great following Debbie around and following Donna Lee around and picking all this low-hanging fruit to produce the studies to show that these fabulous new treatments are effective, and this explosion of all the neuroscience excitement around this that should be taking place. We have the neuroscientists, but they're not trained in optometry, and they can't work as optometrists. So how do you put these two together? So what's needed in the case of neurodevelopmental optometry, and forgive me if this has already happened, but if so, I'm not aware of it, but a major university spending millions of dollars to establish a neurodevelopmental optometry track, design the curriculum, and get certification for it so that neuroscientists can work possibly in conjunction with optometrists that are also trained to work with the neuroscientists to do this work and to further the science. And we don't have that. You have optometrists, you have neuroscientists. The neuroscientists can't treat optometric patients. Optometrists don't have the neuroscience training. And that's a major structural problem that needs to be addressed if we're going to move this forward. And then I'll just mention, similarly with Donna Lee, cognitive restructuring of the kind that Donna Lee does, there are no universities supporting this as a track to do this kind of work.
Well, thank you. I think that gives the Neuroplasticity Alliance, us, a nugget and a goal to contribute time and resources to hopefully helping those things come to fruition, and the funding around more data. Right.
And so those 2 points. One, we need the hard data because modern science is not going to buy it without that.
Right.
There's a lot of low-hanging fruit out there. There are a lot of papers easily generated out of this, exciting papers generated out of this, and that hasn't happened yet, but maybe it will. And the second thing is a curriculum that leads to some kind of certification for cognitive restructuring psychologists of the kind, doing the kind of work that Donna Lee does, and neurodevelopmental optometrists that are neuroscientists, but can practice optometry or at least work directly with optometrists.
Great. Well, you've given NPA lots to work on, so we will be very busy trying to do everything that you're advising. So I think we will record a second segment more on the science for those that are interested. We'll spend a few minutes on a part 2. And we're excited to we'll be speaking to Dr. Marcus and Dr. Zielinski here shortly. So stay tuned with us to learn more about their work and their treatment with patients. So I want to thank Clark so much for being with us today. I'm going to share my screen briefly, just so you all can see. I have put together our contact information, NPA's website, my email if you're interested in reaching out to me directly. I also started a personal blog a couple years ago that I was inspired from reading Clark's book. And so feel free to reach out to me on any channels. Clark also has a website with tons of helpful information, lots of his prior interviews. And so I just can't thank you enough, Clark, for this discussion. And I look forward to staying in touch and following your work.
Emily, thank you so much for doing this work. Really, from the bottom of my heart, thank you for doing this, and with the possibility that many people can be helped by it.